Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I'd like to talk about a very important subject, one I'm particularly interested in as well, and this is to do with science really, and the proper procedure for science, because that's what science actually is. We have it blown up in our culture as this kind of almost like a religion. Again, going back to my video on environmentalism and vegetarianism, you can look at why a lot of people might choose science as a kind of quasi-religion. But really, science is simply a procedure by which humanity has discovered that we can have a reasonable confidence that truth can be discovered and propagated. And that procedure is to come up with some kind of theory about how the world might work, then come up with some kind of experiment that will test that theory, and then do that experiment enough times and in enough places, enough people, that we can be sure that that experiment, the results will always be like that, and therefore we can say, okay, we have established that the world is like this through experiment. And I mean, there's a lot more complexity to the whole procedure, and obviously it doesn't always work out like that. There's all sorts of areas where this method goes wrong. There's any one of these points it can go wrong, and it often does. But yeah, it's probably been one of the most successful methods that's ever been found for establishing truth. And you know, if you want any proof of the power of the scientific method, just look around you. In my room here, you know, I'm surrounded by the products of the scientific method and the wealth that science has brought to humanity. Certainly it's brought a lot more to some people than others. But I mean, almost anyone in the world has benefited enormously from science in terms of their standard of living and their the possibilities that their life provides them. So all this technology really has partly been a result of the scientific method, which I have to say is partly down to my favourite philosopher, René Descartes, who wrote a book in the 1600s about the method, the scientific method that he discovered. And it's essentially doubt. And it's applying doubt all the way along until you cannot apply it any longer. Until doubt is now gone. And at that point you can say, well, we do have truth as far as we can establish it, but we're not closing the book. Science never closes a book. It always says, well, you know, if the method comes up with a new hypothesis that shows an even stronger correlation, i.e. experiment and hypothesis match even better than what we've got now, then we'll swap this hypothesis for this new one. That's perfectly fine and brilliant, and again, that doesn't always work. There's often a process in science where the old idea takes a while to be replaced by the new idea, even though rationally it's clearly a better hypothesis and it more closely matches with reality. It takes a while for the old ideas to die out, and particularly the old people to die out in general who are holding on to the old ideas. Not all of them. I mean, age doesn't necessarily dictate how open somebody is to new ideas. We look at someone like Freeman Dyson, who I think he's about 80 now, a very famous physicist. And he's somebody who, even at that age now, he's still very open to new ideas and very open-minded and open thinking. And, you know, there's many examples, I can't mention them all. So I don't want to be ageist here, it's just a generalisation. But we all use the scientific method. So it's not just something that, you know, some guys in white coats and in the university theoretical physics department need to know about. We all use science, and we all need to know about the right method for using it, because it's so complicated and it's so easy for it to go wrong. And so amateur scientists, as we all are, need to be very careful about how we use the scientific method when we do use it. And, you know, people say, you know, knowledge is power, but sometimes a little bit of knowledge can be worse than none, because you think you've applied the method correctly and you haven't. And this is where certain superstitions, in my opinion, can start to become quite prevalent in society and quite powerful in people's lives, and dangerously so. And one of the dangers of superstition is not just that particular superstition, but the fact that superstition itself can become a kind of habit and can actually, again, as I was talked about in another video, again about environmentalism, vegetarianism, that it can actually damage reason itself, damage reason in our minds and damage reason in public debate. And this reason is such an important tool for us, for human beings. It's not the be all and end all, obviously, but it's so important. Reason is such an important tool. We cannot afford to risk it any more than we have to, and we need to protect it as far as we can. Not to deify it, not to turn it into the be all and end all, but it's such an important tool. And superstition can damage reason in ourselves and in society, and that's partly why I think it's a very important issue. And science is, the scientific method is designed to counter the kind of mental and emotional and psychological issues that human beings have in their search for truth. And so it helps to protect us against some of our blind spots, and one of those is superstition. And there's a particular what I would call a superstition, prevalent in the New Age community, which I'm also a member of, I would say. And I'm very interested in a particular teacher called Teal Swan, who used to be called Teal Scott, and she's recently remarried, she's called Teal Swan. And I have a lot of issues with some of her teachings, and but luckily she's one of those teachers who says, you know, question my stuff. I'm only suggesting things. You go and find out what you find right, you know. And to be fair to her, she actually seems to follow that lip service up with genuine openness and acceptance of people who do not necessarily agree entirely with what she teaches, as far as she could be expected to. You know, it's not an easy thing to do that. And one of the things that's very prevalent in that community that I would regard as superstition is the idea of the Mercury retrograde. And for those of you who haven't heard of this thing, basically it's to do with astrology, and because the Mercury's orbit is closer to the Sun, and because of its particular speed, sometimes from the point of view of the Earth, the Mercury seems to go backwards in relation to the fixed stars. So it's like we're overtaking it, you know, at particular points in its orbit. I think it's because it's elliptical, and I don't know exactly, you can look it up. But be warned, this is a powerful superstition and prevalent. So yeah, so sometimes it appears to go backwards just because it's slowed down in its orbit in relation to us. And this is called a Mercury retrograde, and people in the past used to think that Mercury really did change direction. And but now we know what really happens. And then there's this idea that during a Mercury retrograde, because Mercury is associated with communication and travel and I don't know, whatever else, that during this Mercury retrograde it's particularly difficult for communication and travel, and but on the other hand it's quite positive for shadow work, which is to go into your inner shadow and go backwards into the past. Yeah, it's got its positive and negatives, but the problem with it is, as I say, is that it's probably a superstition, and superstition in itself, I think, is something we need to challenge as those who have a love and a respect for reason, and who think it's an important tool, because, as I say, it is a challenge to reason, superstition, and it does corrupt it. And obviously the scientific method to look at a Mercury retrograde would be statistical. So can we see that there's more often, there's, say, problems with traffic jams during a Mercury retrograde? And particularly if we want to look at places where people haven't ever heard of a Mercury retrograde, because I'm going to call it an MR because I'm sick of saying Mercury retrograde, where people haven't heard of MRs. Yeah, so they, you know, maybe China or somewhere, let's have a look at the incidence of serious traffic jams over the last 20 years and see whether the incidence is higher or lower, or statistically significantly higher or lower during these periods. You know, so in principle it would seem to be very easy to test this statistically. Yeah, what other things could we look at? Train delays, anything where there's records of travel difficulties being kept. We can look at if there's any statistical correlation between the apparent position and direction of Mercury as seen from the Earth and these things. Yeah. In places where people don't know about Mercury retrogrades, MRs. So now the problem is, where people do have this superstition already, as I would call it, is it possible that some of them would actually contribute to travel delays, communication difficulties? Yeah? Is it possible? Well, communications happen between people. So if one person believes this and another person doesn't, it's still going to lead to a difficulty of communication, because the one that does believe it will be creating difficulties unconsciously, obviously, because they think there should be. And in travel, I mean, travel, it all involves other people. Yeah. So we got the train drivers, we got the airline staff, we got the other road users. Now, if they think that during a Mercury retrograde, it's even named to say an MR, if they think that, you know, there should be particular travel problems, they might drive a bit more carefully and a bit more slowly. They might brake a bit more early and a bit more harder than they would normally. And suddenly we've got more traffic jams. And we've got more hold-ups. And we've got more evidence for this superstition. And so you can see why I'm a bit anti this kind of superstition, because it can be very much a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's regardless of what you believe about creating your own reality, as some people do. We definitely create certain aspects of our own reality. We can certainly create communication problems, I can tell you that. Or we can certainly create bloody traffic jams. Just one person acting like an idiot can create a traffic jam on a busy road. Yeah. So, you know, I appeal to anyone who thinks they might be being sold a superstition. Apply the scientific method to it. Look at instances in the past where there was a Mercury retrograde in your own life and ask, was anything particularly happening at that time? Presumably on the internet you can find out a list of recent Mercury retrogrades. And you'll find out, oh no, I had a perfectly good trip to there on that day. Didn't even notice any problems. Yeah. Oh, right, I had that lovely discussion with so-and-so. It's right in the middle of that so-called Mercury retrograde. Strange. Yeah. And so look at all the evidence. Don't just look at that one instance when everything went wrong. He said a bad word there. And it happened to be during an MR. Yeah. That's not evidence. That's just coincidence, probably. Now, you may do this and you may look at it and you may say, well, look, actually, Justin, there's quite a good correlation between this MRs and difficulties I have with communication and with travel. And it's happened for a long time. And it happened before I ever heard of MRs, and before, you know, certainly before I believed in MRs. In that case, maybe it is true for you, but that doesn't mean it's true for other people. So, I suspect if you do find a correlation, it's because you're creating it. Yeah? And it's because you started to believe in it, and then you don't create it in some mystical way, you create it by thinking it's true, and then part of you kind of acting that way. And then perhaps by other people around you who also believe in it, because people around you are going to tend to believe in similar things to you, you know. Which is all a big self-reinforcing circle going on, and it's actually quite a scary phenomenon, I think, from a rational point of view. And so I really hope that before you get into that dark place of MRs, apply the scientific method as far as you can, and stay open-minded, and yeah, stay reasoning. Okay, thanks for watching.